when money stops working, people lose that way of interacting, and it means that your only other options. So how do you get people to do what you want? You threaten them, or you take their stuff, and that's part of where you start. That's where you start to get to the violence in the street and people being miserable. And so I think we are in a dangerous situation. I'm an optimist, so I always think there's ways out. But it also, you have to have this thing of actually doing something to fix people's lives and not patting them on the head and just saying you have to have a better attitude, because that's not going to work.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting you bring that up about that divergence, because it seems like there's a massive divergence right now in society due to COVID-19. And a lot of that's being driven by these economic interests, right? You have people saying, and I would say they have legitimate economic grievances too, because if they're not getting the proper support, then how can they live? But it's kind of creating this air of such distrust of government and distrust of health officials. And it's pretty, well, it's polarizing, but it's also really alarming. And so how do we attempt to mitigate that and show people, listen, like this is the truth. This is a global pandemic. We do have to take this seriously. This isn't a hoax. Yeah. And, you need to listen to your officials.
Well, one of the things we said, and there was another article I was going to share with you, but it was written in March, and somebody said, so this was about a week after we declared the pandemic in Manitoba, and somebody said, we're bound to have protests and riots, because there always have been throughout history in pandemics, which I didn't know. And so because it's hard, right? Is that the things that you're asking people to do to keep each other safe. If the government isn't willing to step in and make sure that people can earn a living or not go bankrupt, the pressures on people are going to be massive. They're intense, and I think that's part of it. Is that so the ways to get out, in terms of building trust, what we suggested back in March was for the government to say, let's have a team of people from all parties, so that it isn't just a question of, well, it's this one party that's to blame. So that when it comes, and we said there are going to be some issues for public, this needs to just be for the public health stuff. For the public, because there's political stuff we're going to disagree on, but there should be stuff we can all agree on together. And if we're all on one page, then it means that nobody can say, well, this is just the PCs doing this, or the Liberals, or the NDP. And that didn't happen. It didn't happen federally either. But that's one of the things you have to do. The hard part is that even going into this, there were people who had a distrust of government and a distrust of healthcare for all sorts of reasons, because it's sort of become very professionalized in a sense, or very clinical, right? People don't have that. They don't have that sense of a relationship of trust, and so you end up getting a downward spiral where this all breaks down, where people don't trust their politicians, they don't trust their government. And that's a hard thing when that's lost, it's hard to recover. The other thing, of course, we have we have opposition politicians who are, I'm an opposition politician too. And so you have to also be critical, where you think the government is being dangerous or making mistakes. But so much of what is politics now is that it's far, far more divisive. So basically, there are a few things that you can use that really motivate people in very negative ways, and one is disgust. So when you look at the conspiracy theories that have been attached to masks and all sorts of other stuff, you also get accusations of child abuse and all sorts of other really serious crimes that are stomach churning often, right? And and there's a great TED talk about the politics of disgust, because it's a way of motivating people. Disgust is the easiest emotion to trigger in people, right? I could tell you some gross story and you'll all feel sick, right? About if I won't, but it's incredibly easy to evoke disgust. So you'll hear when you have rhetoric where people talk about people being vermin or people committing horrific crimes, these are feelings that evoke disgust in people. And the thing that people have found is that disgust tends to make people more politically conservative. So it actually shuts down your openness to other people, right? And this is part of what drives fear in a pandemic. Like, human beings have always lived with illness. We've always lived with the risk of plague and people getting sick. And we've kind of forgotten that because vaccines and modern medicine have been so effective. So as someone who's, I've been not a historian, but a student of history, when I look back, it's amazing to me the sort of forces you see being unleashed one way or another. And some of it is the strong waves of emotion as people are strongly opposing government initiatives, or it's. But the other thing is that it has become a political football. So in the U.S. right now, it is the U.S. sort of ended up becoming a public health hazard for the whole world, just because in two ways. One is that the measures they took failed to contain COVID, but the other is that because it's a presidential election year, everything became politicized. So whether you believe in COVID, whether it's how serious it is, whether to wear a mask or not, all these things have become deeply, deeply politicized, so that you're at this point where even if you're trying to say something true and warn somebody, like I've said this, when you have really serious partisanship, there are times when I stand up and I say something, and I'm not saying it to be political or to get attention or to grandstand. I'm actually trying to tell my opponents, the PCs, look, you're heading for a bridge. It's like I feel like I'm standing on the road with flares and saying, look, the bridge down the way is out. You're about to drive the entire bus over a cliff. Slow down and stop. And people just go, oh, well, you're just saying that because you're a liberal. And that's kind of where we're at with a bunch of stuff in the States as well, where people are saying, please wear a mask, wash your hands, stay indoors, follow these public health measures. And people are saying, well, you're just saying that because you don't want Trump to win. And it's really unfortunate and dangerous, just because we're not able to find that common ground on measures that will make a difference between whether people live or die. And that, it's been like one of the funnier things is that people have sort of said, well, if you ever watched a horror movie and said, well, why would anyone do that, or why would you back into a dangerous room when there's a serial killer around, or why would you? There's no way Jurassic Park would reopen again after all the terrible things that happened. And you go, okay, no, you know what? All that stuff would happen because people are just not. They don't take the risk seriously often until it happens to them, and that's been the challenge, is that you're trying to communicate something, how serious something is, and if it works, like if you actually succeed in avoiding it and preventing something bad from happening, people still don't take it seriously because they don't see what you've prevented.
Yeah, absolutely. It would seem to, well, I mean, everyone knows this, but like this polarization is being primarily driven by social media, right? So I think the reason you're seeing everything become so politicized is that we've never had a platform like this in our lifetime. Well, this is the first time in our lifetime. Like, I remember in 2008, it felt like cooperation was just so different between the Republicans and the Democrats. And now it's just gotten so out of hand. And if you look at what, your random family member might be posting on Facebook regarding COVID, and it's being shared by 5 million people, and then you go on Twitter and then you look at what people are posting about Republicans, it's so out of hand. And I remember when we were talking to you last time, you were kind of interested in bringing up this fact of how social media truly is driving this polarization.
Yeah.
And I want to get more of your perspective on that.
Well, and so some of it is that it is a deliberate. There was another story recently about Facebook, and some of it's just an accident, right? So it's this idea that, or you have algorithms that are set up to feed you certain kinds of information and to keep you engaged and to keep you on the site as much as possible. So what they found is that it was actually, whether it was intentional or not, that they were essentially, algorithms were feeding up more and more radical ideas to people as a way of feeding, and which would eventually drive them towards certain points of view. And I do still try to engage with people who disagree with me. I had a guy who was always saying, he kept messaging me and saying, I'm sure you won't ever dare to answer this, and so we would have this back and forth. But it's clear to me that he's still stuck he keeps retreating into conspiracy theories, like, that COVID is not real, or that it was created on purpose. And part of it is just about the way human brains work. We like stories, and we like stories that are neat and tidy. And the world is not neat and tidy, and the world doesn't follow happy stories with closure. It's often big and messy. They are the truth and reality of history, and the way life really works is not this nice little tale where everything works out in the end. Sometimes it doesn't, but that is so strong and appealing to us that people can't. It's almost like they can't handle the anxiety that comes with not being in control, right? People are. It's if you say, well, why would anyone ever believe that that this virus was created, when we've had viruses and diseases that people have had for thousands, millions of years that were not created in a lab, and it's partly because for people who are conspiracy theorists, there's comfort there in thinking someone is in control, even if it's someone they don't like, or that somebody is actually calling the shots, that this is all organized, because then you might be able to solve it. The hardest part about it is accepting that these are things that we do have control about it, but it's not because but the control is actually with us, for our ability, if we wear masks, if we do the right things. But it ends up being this sort of very superstitious and desperate way of looking at the world, but the hardest part about it is that when people come up with an idea or a theory that's sort of they've set it up in such a way that you cannot possibly get through them, right? That's the hardest part. And actually, that's probably exactly what you talked about when you get into the echo chamber, like when you guys talked about someone who's gotten to the point of radicalization is that whatever you say to them will just be seen as an attempt at manipulating them. Like, they basically, because they've stopped treating you as a human being, it means that that anything you try to say to them is not is seen as a manipulation. It's not seen as sincere. Like, when I say to somebody, like, the reason I don't actually want you to wear a mask because it's a drag. I want you to wear a mask so you don't die. And I had that conversation with somebody online. He said, well, you're just pretending to care. I was like, no, I actually don't want you to die, and I don't want you to get sick and kill me either, right? But people have retreated to that point of mistrust that, and it's because it's like they're holding on so tight to the idea that they can't let go of
it. Just wanted to touch. I think what a lot of this is coming back to is the internet. I think we've mentioned that. You've mentioned just how much distrust has been, I guess, sown by the internet and by social media conglomerates. But I want to ask, do you think in any way, not saying any specific government, but do you think the provincial government has any role to play in regulating the internet to prevent radicalization? Or do you think these kind of oversights will just marginalize groups even further?
I do think that what needs to be done, I do think that there is room for it. We were trying to come up with a bill that would stop the provincial government from advertising on platforms that have hate, right? So, but I think there's two problems. One is that is that we have what you call reliable information, right? The stuff that's produced, it's vetted. An actual person who at a newspaper, for example, that reporter has a name, they have a job. If that newspaper gets sued, specific people will be held to account, right? So publishers, they're all wary. They put more effort into fact checking, right? Because they are all real people and they're accountable. It's like, to me, what has caused the crisis with Facebook and social media, it is partly greed, it is partly algorithms, but what it is fundamentally is that that Facebook is not accountable for anything it puts online, and neither is YouTube, and neither is Google. And that is a specific law in the Millennium Copyright Act that says it actually makes Facebook possible. It says that Facebook and Google and YouTube are not responsible for what is on their platform. That's somebody else's business. You can post whatever you want, and then someone complains and they'll take it down later. Well, that's not good enough.